Okay, should be set. Okay, hi everybody, welcome. My name is Hannah. I'm the president of College Democrats at UCF. We also have, I'll let the PSA president introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Ferrazzoli. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the president of Pride Student Association.
And then we're also joined today by Representatives Anna Eskamani and Carlos Guillermo-Smith. So thank you guys so much for joining us. So this town hall discussion is going to be surrounding LGBTQ plus policy in Florida and also in the nation. So we're very excited to have them with us today. Carlos represents House District 49, which is the district that UCF is in. So if you live on campus or anywhere near campus, he is your House representative. And then Representative Eskamani represents District 47, which is the downtown area. So I'll give both of them the opportunity to do a quick introduction. You guys want to do that?
Hi, well, good evening. Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you to the Pride Student Association and the UCF College Democrats for hosting this really, really important forum. So as Hannah said, I'm Carlos Guillermo-Smith, and I am a state representative. I represent the UCF main campus in the Florida House, as well as Waterford Lakes, Rio Pinar, the University Boulevard and Union Park kind of area. So if you live within those geographic boundaries, I'm officially your state representative. But really, if you live in the area, I'm still your unofficial representative of all things related to fairness and equality in the Florida legislature. With the help of many folks in the community in 2016, my campaign for the Florida House made state history because I became the first openly LGBTQ Latinx member of the Florida legislature. And I say that because representation, as we know, matters very deeply, especially to marginalized and underrepresented communities that have for so long been denied a seat at the table. We all know that for many generations, our community, LGBTQ, people of color, queer, Latinx, Black, Hispanic, we've been underrepresented for so long, but specifically, LGBTQ people have been the targets of homophobia, transphobia, bigotry, hate violence, the politicization of homophobia and transphobia in a way that's been weaponized and dangerous. So I see it as a great thing that we have the capability to use our voice in many ways, including standing up and calling out and pushing back on the bigots ourselves, not only in representative government and representative democracy, but also at the ballot box, as what is happening right now as we speak. So it's really, really great to be here with you all. And full disclosure, I know that we have for those of you who don't know, we have a part-time legislature in Florida, which means unlike Congress, we don't maintain a calendar of legislative activity all year long. We're in Tallahassee for the official legislative session, really 60 days out of the year. It's certainly a full-time job, even though we're considered a part-time legislature, as I know my colleague, Representative Eskamani, can attest to. We're always working on behalf of our constituents. But that's a long way of saying that most of us actually have a side job in addition to being state lawmakers. My side job, as it was even before I was elected, is actually I work for Equality Florida, our state's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization. So if it wasn't already obvious, of course, queer liberation and equality is a very, very important priority to me personally, as a human, professionally as well, and also in the Florida legislature. So thank you all for having us.
Thanks so much, Rep. Smith. It's an honor to join everyone today. Again, my name is Anna Eskamani. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And really always thrilled to not only connect with our students, but of course, enter the conversation on directly impacted people. And in this context, folks who identify as LGBTQ+. I do identify myself as an accomplice, which for me, that means going beyond allyship. I'm not having a transactional relationship with directly impacted communities, but one that's actually transformational, one that focuses on allowing our LGBTQ plus folks to lead the discussion, to live life as their authentic selves, and for folks like me not to walk ahead of you in this work, but to really walk side by side and to do whatever I can with the privilege that I have as a cis hetero person, to lift up these issues and to demonstrate to my colleagues in the Florida legislature that they need to stop attacking LGBTQ people and to instead focus on some of the issues that Rep. Smith already outlined, ending discrimination in workplaces and in public accommodations based on sexual orientation, gender identity, prohibiting the ability for private voucher schools to discriminate against students and faculty, whether they receive public money or not, but especially for those that receive public money, ensuring that we end the criminalization of HIV and support those that have a positive test result and be able to still live a full and happy life, stigmatize HIV, address the criminalization of consensual sex workers, and knowing that so many of our consensual sex workers are trans people and people of color. And so, how is that connection? How does that also connect to mass incarceration as a whole? So there's so many layers here that we need to be very intersectional in when we're talking about policy. But I think something that's very common in Florida is that we pretty much do the opposite of everything we should be doing. I think one of the only issues we've seen some proactive movement on is around HIV, and even that stalls in the Florida House and tends to get more traction in the Senate, which we can talk about more soon too. But these issues are deeply personal for me. I mean, District 47, we're home to Pulse nightclub, where we lost 49 angels at the hands of a gunman. One of the reasons why I ran for office was because I was completely outraged by the inaction of the current incumbent who represented this district and his lack of ability to address both gun violence and hate crimes and LGBTQ plus equality. I made a decision back then. The district didn't need a moderate Republican, but a really strong Democrat to fight for these issues unapologetically. And to that point, Equality Florida, which Rep. Smith mentioned, is a really incredible organization. My twin sister used to work at Equality Florida, and they have their gala this Friday virtually, as I'm sure folks know. And I'm proud to be the local Orlando Gala's 2020 Voice for Equality honoree, which is something that's very, very humbling for me. But it's a reflection of how, thanks, Rep. Smith. It's a reflection of how, I don't care about the backlash. I really don't. Like, because if folks who don't get it, then I'm not the issue. You are facing an issue, right? And even right now, during the 2020 campaign trail, my opponent has attacked me for supporting gender fluidity. He used photos that I posted of a gender neutral bathroom to attack me, and says that he supports traditional marriage structures, which of course is both homophobic as it is in his other comments transphobic. So we're committed to calling that out and to ensuring that Orlando and Central Florida and the state become champions on these issues. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions and any insight that y'all have to also share with us as we prepare these next 8 days of the election cycle, and of course back in Tallahassee.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much for being here. Just before we get started with questions, I want to say the chat is totally open. If anybody wants to put anything in there, feel free to put your reactions or anything in there. Rep. Smith has got his reactions going. Feel free to use there's a thumbs up, a clap, all of that kind of stuff. So all of this is open. There you go. Matthew's demonstrating. But okay, so let's go ahead and get started with questions. Okay, so our first one is, can you talk about some of the bills you've sponsored or co-sponsored in the past relating to the LGBTQ plus community?
So I'll get started with this one. So I think it's important, especially for this discussion, because the LGBT agenda for equality and fairness is a really broad agenda that didn't end certainly when marriage equality was declared the law of the land in 2015. While that was a tremendous ruling and just a monumentous moment in American history and LGBTQ civil rights, there's so much work left to be done that is totally decoupled from marriage equality. And what I really want to try to focus on for today's discussion is understanding the clear distinction between what role does Congress and a future Biden-Harris administration have on the issue of LGBTQ equality versus how much work do we have to do right here in the state of Florida, and how important our state legislature is in advancing LGBTQ equality, and to an extent, also our local school boards, our county commissions, and our city governments in advancing LGBTQ equality as well. Of course, we're members of the Florida House, and so I can tell you right now what the pro-equality agenda is in the Florida legislature. It's first and foremost, our key priority is passing the Florida Competitive Workforce Act. For those who don't know, the Florida Civil Rights Act of 1992, when passed, did not include protections for sexual orientation and gender identity. The Florida Civil Rights Act covers 3 categories and says that people have a right to not be discriminated against in employment, housing, and public accommodations. Now, many of you know that this summer, there was another monumental and incredible Supreme Court ruling in the United States, the Bostock ruling. The Bostock ruling essentially guaranteed employment protections for LGBTQ people. This was a tremendous ruling for a number of reasons. First, because it means now that the employment protections are the law and that they exist. And from what we already understand and know is that while LGB people are also discriminated against in the workplace, a majority of the discrimination that takes place in the 2020 workplace is against transgender Americans. So now finally having a ruling that guarantees that non-discrimination protection for transgender workers specifically is huge. But the Florida Competitive Workforce Act was about more than employment. It was housing and public accommodations as well. So that remains a key priority. And we also have to know, and this may be another part of the discussion later, that the workplace equality ruling still has a giant loophole the size of a football field, which is religious exemptions and RFRAs, Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, which exist in the state of Florida, which basically mean there's a lot of people who work in religious or faith-based organizations that are technically not covered by that ruling. So we also have to ban conversion therapy in the state of Florida. That is legislation that both myself and Rep. Eskamani have championed. We also have to make sure that we prohibit anti-LGBTQ discrimination at private schools that are funded by taxpayer money. We have to make sure that we have to have inclusive sex education in our public schools that includes LGBTQ people, anti-bullying policies in our public school, because we know that LGBTQ youth continues to be victimized by bullying, both in public and in private schools. Anna spoke about HIV modernization, access to healthcare, teaching LGBTQ history in our schools, guaranteeing or making more available affordable housing, especially for people living with HIV. We haven't seen a bill introduced yet, but I'm already talking actually to some students who are interested in prohibiting the gay panic defense and the trans panic defense in a court of law. A lot of times LGBTQ people are survivors of hate violence, and their attackers use the gay or trans panic defense to say, oh my God, I just found out they were gay or trans, and therefore I was justified in my physical attack and act of violence against this person. It's a bogus defense, but people use it. And there's actually there's so much more. We have such a large LGBT agenda in the state legislature. I think I'm forgetting at least one. Maybe Anna can chime in. Talking.
I love it too. I mean, you just did a really great list of issues. I mean, again, I mentioned already how backwards Florida is, and I think the fact that Rep. Smith just painted, issues that are impacting both just equity along for lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks, let alone issues impacting our trans voices or gender nonconforming voices. And unfortunately, we've actually seen the opposite in the legislature, where trans kids specifically have been attacked and adults when it comes to so many occasions where our Republican colleagues try to carve out trans issues. And it's very much as a divide and conquer tactic, if you will. And candidly, we see that in a lot of social movements. I mean, even when you look back to women's suffrage, where like Black folks were basically still faced suppression and disenfranchisement while white women could vote. And so time and time again, you see even within marginalized communities, efforts by outsiders being made to divide us in an effort to get a little piece of the progress done. And chances are addressing the entire system is never going to happen, or it's going to take decades for it to happen. And so we can't let our opponents divide us in that way. To that point, I'm sure Huey mentioned it, but just to highlight, one of our biggest bills we filed last session was to end the discrimination taking place within private LGBTQ, the discrimination impacting LGBTQ plus youth and their families in private voucher schools that receive public money. So long story short, Florida has had a pretty proactive effort of privatizing public education. And this has taken shape in a few different ways. And I think that a lot of advocates often get charter schools confused with voucher schools. So I'll unpack it really quick. But of course, you have traditional public schools, right? Which we always kind of envision as the large schools, the high schools that have the football teams, all that kind of stuff, right? And so traditional public schools are statutory required to be provided X number of funding per pupil. There's a lot of federal requirements as well, a lot of testing that takes place, a lot of oversight. Then you have charter schools, which are every school choice person will tell you that they're still public schools, and indeed charter schools do exist within a school district, and they do have a little bit of oversight from that school board, and some of them are nonprofits, some of them are mom and pop, some focus on like very unique niche communities such as students with disabilities, but they do receive public money to exist as charter schools, and they don't face the same type of building requirements or testing requirements compared to traditional public schools. But then you have voucher schools, right? So these are two separate things. Voucher schools are basically a parent getting a voucher, like almost like think of a coupon that they can bring to any private school that they want to basically have that money for the traditional public school go to the private school. And one of the biggest alarming things about this is that there's no oversight. There's like absolutely no regulation whatsoever. And we have seen like new private schools pop up because it really is like a money-making enterprise. I mean, when you think about it, if you want to open a private school and you keep your costs really low, then you can make money by recruiting students. And there's no metrics to really grade the school by. The opponents will tell us, well, it's school choice. If a parent isn't happy there, they can just go somewhere else. But the reality is that some of these schools can be very exploitative. They could be unclear about the educational environment. And not every parent is going to be as engaged to be able to even detect if something's wrong at the school. And so it really is a problematic structure that not only has taken money directly out of traditional public schools, but has gone to unregulated environments that can be really dangerous for a child's health and well-being. To that point, we have the Orlando Sentinel did an investigation earlier this year, late last year, that uncovered a lot of these schools had dramatically awful anti-LGBTQ plus policies, not only punishing students if they identified as gay or trans, but even if their parents were gay, that they would be expelled from the educational environment. And again, none of these policies even address teachers who are gay. And just this past week in the Orlando Sentinel, you might have read the story about Steven, who was a gay teacher at a Longwood voucher school that was fired for being gay. And I mean, these are really common situations. One of our other advocates, her name is Monica, and she was fired from a Brevard County school because she was spotted at Space Coast Pride. And that led to her being fired for being gay from her private school that receives public money. So all that said and done, last session we filed legislation to end discrimination in any school that receives public money when it comes to the students and their families. And of course, bills like the Competitive Workforce Act, CWA, would help protect those employees. Neither bill passed, and it did lead to hours of debate and a lot of just attacks that Rep. Smith and I faced during that time, very heated moments. And just to be clear too, I mean, like Rep. Smith said, it's frustrating because the religious freedom talking point is often used, but at the same time, we see religious institutions that are inclusive. I mean, I'm thinking about Bishop Moore High School in my district. This is a Catholic high school, and they have policies that are inclusive to LGBTQ plus people. I'm sure there are folks watching us right now that either identify as LGBTQ plus or are an accomplice, and they also potentially have a religious background, right? So these don't have to be exclusive, but the fact that it was made to be exclusive was incredibly problematic because, again, it's one thing if you're not receiving public money, but if you are receiving taxpayer money, then there has to be a basic standard to protect youth. And during our policy work, we also learned that there's discrimination based on race already taking place within these institutions. And whether it comes to, discrimination based on hair type or hairstyle, or just based on color of skin, those have already been reported issues at these voucher schools that the voucher organizations are aware of. And so now there is an external effort of reform. Equality Florida has launched a voluntary training program of these voucher schools to train educators on safe school approaches and on inclusivity. But again, that is voluntary, and there is still a larger issue that has to be done when it comes to these schools that receive public money and discriminate against, I would say, students, their families, and of course their staff and teachers. So that was a long answer, but we do have a lot of work to do, and that's one of the biggest current issues right now.
Awesome.
Can I add to that real quick as well? I wanted to add to clarify, because this is what's really, I don't think it's that unique about this issue, but it's something worth pointing out, which is that two really important issues that are impacted by elections and politics, education and LGBTQ rights. These two issues have collided in this way that we basically, every single year as a state, Florida spends $1 billion with a B in taxpayer money to fund private schools. That's education privatization that hurts our public schools. And the Republicans who have advocated for these education privatization policies, they are doing so in a way that they're also saying, not only are we going to take these resources away from public schools and divert them to private schools, but we also are not going to require like little to no standards. They're requiring no standards for these private schools to be able to be eligible to receive this money. One of those no standards is non-discrimination standards. That's why Anna sponsored a bill that I co-sponsored that said, if you are a private school and if you are accepting taxpayer dollars in the school voucher program, you cannot have policies that say things like students who say I am gay or I am transgender will be expelled. I want to underscore that point. It's the year 2020, and right here in Florida, the Orlando Sentinel found 83 private schools that had policies in writing that said those two things. Students who say I am gay or I am transgender will be expelled, and they're funded by taxpayers. And in 2020, last week, Stephen was fired as a teacher from a private school that also receives taxpayer money. And the superintendent put in writing, we found out in a gay parenting magazine in the article that like they had the nerve to put it in writing. You know how sometimes the discrimination happens verbally, it's very disguised, it's very veiled, they don't say anything, they don't want to get caught like saying what we know they're doing, discriminating. The superintendent sent an email to the teacher and said, we heard in this article that you are in a relationship with another man and that you have children, and you, this man, and your collective children call yourselves a family. you know that violates our policy, and we are therefore firing you. This is 2020, and it's legal. This is why Anna and I are championing this legislation, because we know discrimination is wrong, but it's made worse when it's funded by taxpayers.
Absolutely. It's very disheartening that we do still have to have these discussions in October of 2020. But, so we're going to move on to the next question. So it is no secret that the Florida legislature is dominated by the Republican Party, and LGBTQ plus protection is not a priority. Aside from voting them out, what can be done to ensure that LGBTQ plus Floridians are protected? Representative Eskamani, we'll start with you.
I mean, the biggest thing is to definitely vote. And so just to emphasize that here in Orange County, we do see really strong voter turnout, especially compared to 2016. But the youth vote is still not as high as compared to other counties. And so I don't know how many folks here are competitive, but Orange County is a step up. And we got to get out the youth vote. So anything y'all can do to help get more students out to vote, I'm committed to that as well. Rep Smith and myself are at the Alafaya Branch Library on Sunday, and I'll be back at UCF this week as well for another event hosted with the Biden campaign. So we're doing everything we can to help make sure students are ready to vote. And in my district, I have Rollins College. We're very focused on the Rollins student body as well. And so anything to do to help more young people understand what's at stake in this election cycle by centering on these topics, I think is really, really important. And we do have some exciting opportunities to potentially flip the Senate, or at least get very close to flipping it, and to flip a lot of seats in the Florida House. And even if we move from 47, which is where we are right now, we have 47 Democrats out of 120. If we can move that up to like 55, 56, I mean, we're still not in the majority, but that's the closest we've been in decades. And it definitely sets the tone with our Republican colleagues. Like, can't continue to be so extreme if they hope to continue winning in the state. So voting is essential. Now, other tactics to consider, I mean, as soon as November 3rd is over, obviously folks got to get some self-care. And so, I know it's also final season's going to come up soon. So take care of yourselves. But what I want to just remind folks is that elections are just one part of a path towards collective liberation. It's a tactic. We all should vote, and we will vote, and that can set the stage of the legislative landscape. But it also set the stage of what's possible in legislative session, and allow you to figure out, who do I need to contact now to build a relationship, to share my concerns before folks even get to Tallahassee, before folks even get sworn in. And of course, if you're at UCF, you're in the hands of Rep Smith, who's a rock star on these issues. But think about your hometown, and who is your lawmaker for your hometown? And can you contact that person and express to them your policy priorities, and kind of create pressure with them early on that you want to see them co-sponsor the Competitive Workforce Act. You want to see them co-sponsor the Panic Defense Repealer. You want to have your list and be very specific of what you're requesting these future lawmakers to do. And follow them on Twitter, keep in touch with them in different ways. And of course, remember that power is built collectively, and power is neither good or bad. So think about, how do I open up these opportunities to other people, like we're doing tonight? Who else can I invite to this space that maybe isn't as active in the legislative process, who doesn't really know the state lawmaker structures as well, that I can bring in, I can teach, and I can empower. And so, continuing to organize students around these issues, thinking about who their specific lawmakers are, making that contact and pushing on these important issues will help keep the topic always in the forefront, even when there isn't a crisis, right? Because that's one thing that always frustrates me, especially about the abortion rights movement. If I put my Planned Parenthood hat on, and folks know that I worked at Planned Parenthood for 6 years before I ran for office. And, so many politicians only talk about abortion when it's under attack. And the reality is that reproductive rights and reproductive health, reproductive justice is always an issue every single day. Every single day, there is someone that is faced with a challenging decision of what to do with their pregnancy. And based on where they live and how much money they have, their decisions are going to vary. Their options are going to vary, and that's not right. You know, every person should have the ability to raise a child, choose adoption, or end a pregnancy whatever feels right at that moment based on their family, their God, their health. And yet, based on economics and based on geography, that's not the reality. And yet we only see folks really talk about abortion when it's politically convenient. And so we need to change that with so many different issues, including LGBTQ plus issues. We should always be talking about this, not just when it's a hot topic or when it's Pride Month. You know, we should be talking about these 24/7. And as leaders, you can help carry that conversation all the time.
Can I add to that? I promise I'll be short. Well, I'll try to be short. So I'm glad that Rep. Eskamani mentioned what to do after an election, because it reminds me of how I first really got involved. Because when I think of my own and I reflect on my own political engagement, like, I don't even want to think about my volunteerism for the Obama campaign in 2008, because it was just like, it was such a drop in the bucket on like what I was going to actually do. Like, I drove voters to polls like for Obama in 2008. You know, I made some calls, I did some door knocking, but we won. And it was such an exhilarating feeling. But after we won, and at the time I was a manager for the Men's Warehouse, which I was a manager for the Men's Warehouse for 8 years. Okay, like politics was not always in my background. After we won, and after I got some self-care and, you know, we got all the partying and celebrating out of the way, I was like, what now? Like, what am I supposed to do? How do I get involved? How do I help President Obama implement a progressive agenda? And I got really good advice from my friend Joe Saunders at the time. He said, what you're going to want to do is volunteer for everything. Volunteer for everything. So to answer that question that was originally asked, like, what do we do? Because we know that, you know, there's this despicable GOP majority in Tallahassee. Like, how do we protect LGBT people without necessarily, you know, winning a majority in the legislature this cycle, which is unlikely, but possible. It's volunteer for equality-minded organizations and do what you can to help equality-minded causes. Here locally, what does that mean? It means volunteering for the Zebra Coalition, which is an amazing organization that helps with LGBTQ youth that are dealing with homelessness or housing insecurity. It's volunteering for organizations like Equality Florida. I know that sounds like a shameless plug, but I mean, that's what I was told to do in 2009 after Obama's inauguration, volunteer for HRC and Equality Florida. And I did that, and I got really engaged and involved in local LGBTQ initiatives as a result. Also, and I know that you're students, so you probably don't have a huge budget, but you know, maybe you know someone who does, maybe your parents, you know, someone like, there's a lot of different funds that are helping folks, especially folks who are vulnerable to COVID, LGBTQ folks who are vulnerable during COVID-19 for a number of reasons. And Anna and I actually, before this event, were talking about an LGBTQ relief fund, which is a spinoff of the Contigo Fund, which is known for doing a lot of pro-LGBT work here in Orlando after Pulse. And you can always donate to their GoFundMe because they're doing a lot to really lift up LGBTQ people here locally that are struggling. And I'm going to post a link in the chat to them.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's very important to remember that like politics doesn't only happen during election season, that people still need help even when there's not an election happening. So great, that's some great advice. Okay, so what do you think in terms of LGBTQ plus protection? UCF does well to protect our LGBTQ plus students, and where do you see room for improvement? We'll start with Carlos on this one.
So where do we need to improve? Well, you know, we have the Pride Student Association who's hosting this. So first and foremost, I want to thank them for the work that they're doing. But I think one of the really, really important things and we see this especially now in the last several months, is solidarity with other marginalized communities. And again, I want to applaud people who are on this call, because what we've seen, and we especially need to continue seeing this, especially in LGBTQ spaces, is understanding that the liberation, freedom, equality, and justice for other marginalized and oppressed communities is intrinsically linked to ours as LGBTQ people. So during the protests and peaceful demonstrations this summer around George Floyd, around Black Lives Matter, I thought it was very, very important. And I was proud to see, although I feel like there was probably room for more growing and more opportunity, I thought it was very important during those social justice movements to see LGBTQ people out there being a part of that movement, not trying to lead the movement, because, you know, what we have to do is we have to make sure that we're lifting up other people and not trying to co-opt other movements with our own message, but being there in solidarity with other marginalized communities, because we know that we have shared enemies, we have shared oppressors who often go about oppressing our communities in different ways and using different tools, but the outcome ends up being the same. So being able to continue to stand in solidarity with other communities as LGBTQ and queer people, I think is really important.
And then to add to that, because I think that's a really excellent point, and to, you know, move beyond performance to actually demonstrate solidarity. I think UCF over the last 20 years has been intentional in improving their inclusivity and their policies to reflect the diversity of LGBTQ plus people, and to also help empower both students and faculty to hold the university accountable. And in particular, I know that UCF has a faculty that's pride-oriented. They do have a non-discrimination policy that embraces both sexual orientation and gender identity. Areas of improvement would include not only what Rep. Smith already outlined, but I would also add thinking about the other segments of a university that intersect with LGBTQ plus issues. For example, health services. Like, are our health services at UCF inclusive? Are staff trained on pronouns? If you ask a school health services provider for HRT, are they going to know what that means and be able to provide you with that guidance? I mean, when I worked at Planned Parenthood for 6 years, you know, we have a health center that's right by UCF, and many students would come to us, even though they could access free services on campus, because they were concerned about privacy, especially if they were seeking reproductive health services, if there were questions about their sexual behavior, if that would be disclosed to someone else on campus and potentially embarrass or shame them. And of course, when it comes to trans inclusivity and support for gender non-conforming folks, you know, is there going to be competency, you know, within the healthcare staff? So I think there's been some really great reporting nationally about the lack of investment in school health services in general, more in the context of COVID-19. But of course, you know, that translates to lack of investment in the healthcare system as a whole in general. And I do think that that's always going to be an area where we need to make sure staff are trained, you know, annually on these issues, and that there's an intentional effort to make sure every student is comfortable. And so that's kind of where my mind goes first. But, you know, I think even just ensuring that all staff, professors, faculty are inclusive, and that, I don't know if the freshman orientation reviews these policies, but even thinking about incoming students, you know, I remember when I was a freshman back in 2008, you know, a lot of curriculum came our way during the orientation. And then when I started my grad school program at UCF in 2015, I believe, 2012, I graduated in 2015. So when I started my master's program in 2012, I actually did have to participate in this virtual video curriculum about drug usage, but also about consent. And to echo Rep. Smith's point, you know, I think more of those basic social skills are needed in spaces, because we can't assume that a student coming into UCF has ever learned consent, has ever learned about gender inclusivity. And so, these are the policies, but how do we teach the policies to one another so that we can actually implement them, practice them intentionally and proactively. So I wonder if anything, what's being integrated into those spaces for new students coming in, for new faculty coming in, to make sure everyone is on the same page.
Amazing. Yes. Thank you for that. I think we are going to take one more pre-written question, and then we're going to move on to some pre-submitted questions from our members. So lastly, what advice would you give to a UCF student wanting to pursue politics or just LGBTQ plus advocacy? Representative Smith, we'll start with you.
Thank you for that. So I do want to kind of underscore and revert back to my answer from the previous question about volunteerism. Like, I think a lot of people make assumptions about me because I am a loud, proud, elected official in the area who's really engaged, obviously, in politics and obviously an elected member of the legislature. They assume that I have like a degree from UCF in political science or LGBTQ rights or something like that. Like, I don't. I have a BSBA in business administration from the UCF School of Business. Go Knights. I love how Anna was reflecting on her freshman year in 2008. My freshman year at UCF, 1999. Okay, like Backstreet Boys, #1 hits. Like, it was way back in the day. But I bring that up to say I'm not the person that, and there's nothing wrong with this necessarily. I'm not the person that was like, you know what? I want to be an elected official. I want to be elected to Congress or the legislature, and that's going to be my goal. And I really want to run for office someday. That wasn't my plan. That's what happened. But it happened because, to your point and the point of the question, I got involved. And I got involved when I was already in a set career path, being a manager of the Men's Warehouse and retail management. When I started volunteering and showing up to spaces and phone banks and Equality Florida networking events and stuff like that, people started to associate me not with the Men's Warehouse. They started associating me with the local Democratic Party or Equality Florida or the Human Rights Campaign. And so they started perceiving me as Carlos, the organizer and activist, not Carlos, the manager at Men's Warehouse. And after that, things happened relatively quickly, I feel like, and it wasn't even part of the plan. My goal, until I declared that I was running for this seat in 2015, that was the moment when my career goal changed. Up until that point, my career goal was, I want to be a staffer on Capitol Hill in Washington. I wanted to be the behind the scenes person. And I was that in Tallahassee for 2 former lawmakers. And, things happen and opportunities presented themselves. And then all of a sudden I started wondering, like, who is going to run for this seat? And then I started imagining myself in the role. And it no longer felt like a far-fetched, crazy idea that I just came up with. It was like, wait, I can do that. I know that place in Tallahassee. I know the legislative process. I've watched these floor speeches over and over and over again from other people. And I feel like I have an understanding of the issues. And once I had that confidence, finally, I'm just like, wait, you know what? Fuck it. Run. Do it. And then it happened. And that's not even ultimately the goal. Like, a lot of people want to get involved in politics, and like me, their goal is not to be in an elected position, but to make a difference. And I think volunteerism is the way to do it.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that. I was going to say, Rep. Smith's prior answer is a good review for this one. The only thing I'll add is, on-campus organizing is fantastic. That's really where my sister and I grew as leaders, was at the University of Central Florida. First with the environmental movement. I'm a vegan and really big on climate change issues as well. And so we started getting involved in those spaces, and then got engaged with international human rights with the Iranian Student Organization. And that's when we met the College Democrats back in 2010, where I officially became a Democrat because I was NPA before, and got really involved in local issues, building relationships with the Pride Student Association, with SLAP, with so many other organizations. The NOW chapter, the Planned Parenthood chapter back then was Vox. Now it's called Generation Action. But just really built these incredible coalitions on campus. We even formed, I think it was called the Progressive Student Coalition and things like that. So learn everything you can on campus at UCF, get involved, build these relationships, get to know your professors and keep them in mind in the future. Identify your mentors. These are all folks that will be your forever friends, and they'll help you with letters of recommendations in the future. I still have professors I go to for letters of rec that knew me when I was a freshman. And it's pretty incredible just how folks show up for you in ways you don't even expect. But it's up to you to build those relationships and keep them alive, as you grow and pursue different things in life. But just do what you can when you're on campus. It's a great time to be a student. Whatever you can do to also integrate research into your activism, I think is really important. My sister and I were both honors in the major students. So I did my undergraduate thesis on feminism in Iran, and really got to explore the issues that I cared about from an academic perspective as well. And that's not necessary. Like Rep Smith said, you can study anything and get involved civically. But if you do see yourself as wanting to, find a career in this work, see what you can learn and grow even in your discipline. If you're a business major, you can do an honors the major thesis looking at LGBTQ equity within businesses, right? There's like a lot of great intersections you could find that reflect your academic focus while also integrating the issues you care about.
All right, great. So we're going to move on now to some of the questions that were submitted by you guys in our Google form. So we'll start with, what steps will you take to ensure that conversion therapy gets banned statewide in Florida? We'll start with Representative Smith.
Maybe this is like a lightning round. Well, we are committed to co-sponsoring the legislation again. That is legislation that has been filed in the Florida legislature that I've co-sponsored in the past and that Anna has. And I don't want to speak for her, but I'm pretty sure she's ready to co-sponsor again as I am.
Yes. And Rep. Smith and I have been involved locally at the county level. There has been a local effort to ban conversion therapy here in Orange County. And I think COVID-19 kind of put it on pause, unfortunately. But we both sent statements of support and, any effort to ban it, we're on board.
Absolutely. That's a huge issue I know right now within the LGBT community. So it's a great thing that you both are working to get rid of it. Moving on, what are you two working on to add LGBT protections to the state of Florida? Are there still no statewide laws that prohibit discrimination, whether in the workforce place, the public, or otherwise? We'll start with Representative Eskamani.
Sure. I mean, the short answer is that unfortunately there really isn't anything statewide. That's one of the biggest goals of our work and of Equality Florida. The Competitive Workforce Act, or CWA, correct me if I'm wrong, Rep. Smith, but it's been filed, I think, for over 12 years now. It's been over a decade. And to my knowledge and my years of advocacy, it had one hearing in the Senate, and then it got temporarily postponed because it didn't have the final votes to pass that committee. So we do have a fabric of protections, based on counties and cities, but there really is a need for something statewide.
On a related note, I just want to say this. This might be really into the weeds politics, but I don't think it is. I think it's important for you to understand this. We are often, and both Anna and I are tried and true progressives, and I like to see myself as a pragmatic progressive. That every issue is very different as far as whether or not incrementalism is acceptable progress on a specific issue or not. When it comes to the issue of LGBTQ equality, I don't think incrementalism is acceptable as it relates to prohibiting discrimination against LGBTQ people. Specifically, I want to kind of clue you in on some efforts that have even come from other Democrats in the last few years that have really bothered me around statewide legislation. What they have tried to do is they have tried to, in an effort to pass something for LGBTQ people, or really LGBT people, they have tried to toss the Competitive Workforce Act out, which is the most popular bill by co-sponsorship in the Florida legislature, by the way, by removing from the bill the portion around public accommodations. Why, if we suddenly remove public accommodations, is the bill going to get heard? Well, because attached to the conversation on public accommodations is the conversation about bathrooms, which always immediately is susceptible to transphobic bigotry, rhetoric, and fear-mongering from the other side. So in an effort to essentially just take the transgender conversation and protections out of the bill because it was too, quote, difficult, many folks have tried to advocate that we capitulate on the Competitive Workforce Act, remove public accommodations from there, essentially removing the T from the conversation so that we can declare a win for the community. I do not believe that is acceptable. I think that every effort that we make to advance LGBTQ equality, even if it's an incremental change, has to be one that is in lockstep with every single part of our community. And that especially means the transgender, gender nonconforming, and gender non-binary community, which frankly is the part of our community that experiences the most discrimination, the most bigotry, the most hate violence, and the most vulnerable overall. And so I can make the commitment to you now that we're not going to accept those types of attempts to jettison protections for transgender people simply for political expediency.
Thank you, Representative Smith. I just want to say that is like a great point. And you definitely want to look into everybody that you're voting for, not just voting for people because they're Democratic. Even if they are Democratic, LGBTQ plus protections might not be at the top of their list. So always look into who you're voting for.
Especially in primaries. Primaries can make a huge difference. Obviously, the election coming up is not a primary, but you need to make sure, like, if some of these, like, not so great Democrats are being primary, that you're looking into who those advocates are. Okay, but moving on to our next pre-submitted question. Oh, before we move on, I just want to say that in the next section will be like audience questions. If you would like to ask the question yourself, you'll be able to do that. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question on your own, you can send it to either myself or to Anna, and we can ask that for you. Okay. Moving on. How has LGBTQ plus policy and politics changed since the Pulse nightclub tragedy? We'll start with Rep. Smith.
So it has changed. I think that it has changed for the better. I think that locally is where we saw the most change. We saw some Republican leaders who maybe were in the middle of an evolution towards acceptance and affirmation of LGBTQ people before Pulse nightclub, but then that terrible tragedy really accelerated that process. We saw less of that outside of the Central Florida area. What also came as a result of Pulse as it relates to policy is we saw so much more conversations around how gun violence is a problem and a crisis that once again disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. Long story short, when communities are the subject of hate violence, discrimination, and bigotry, easy access to firearms means that you can more easily and more lethally, frankly, carry out acts of violence against specific communities. It did not end with Pulse nightclub. You know, we saw some of these mass shootings in El Paso as well, or where the Latinx community was targeted. We see it on an everyday level, especially with Black transgender women who are frequently and most oftenly the targets of hate violence, and the weapon of choice is a firearm. And so these are all unfortunate and tragic, but strong examples of how the movement for LGBTQ equality has a direct intersection with the movement to prevent gun violence.
Yeah, and I don't know what else I can really add. I mean, I think that there's still so much transactionalism. I think there's also this dynamic of folks just, they don't think this is a problem. Like they just legitimately don't think this is a problem. And I think through storytelling, we're able to help shift that type of pivot by centering the conversation on directly impacted people. I mean, in particular, the attacks on trans youth this past year, what really, I think, helped to stop that bill from even really being heard as a bill was directly impacted people sharing their stories, was parents of trans kids speaking out. I mean, it was powerful to watch, to see a committee room filled with those that identify as LGBTQ plus and those who care about them. And you could just feel the frustration, like this fuming, I don't want to say anger, but just kind of like disgust of like, how dare you attack our kids? You know what I mean? Like it was like mama bear vibes. Like it was really, really powerful. And these lawmakers, you know, just like pie in their face, like they're just perpetuating bogus science and creating deep harm for our young people and for these families who've already been through so much just to get to a point where their child loves themselves, right? So I do think we need to continue to elevate these stories. I unfortunately, one of the clearest examples I can give you of you know, policy changes due to tragedy is the difference between how lawmakers responded to Parkland, the deep loss at Parkland, compared to Pulse. And of course, there were other dynamics. You know, when the shooting at Parkland happened, it was in the middle of legislative session, compared to Pulse, where it was before an election year. But either way, the fact that a bill was passed because of Parkland and nothing happened legislative wise because of Pulse, I think is another clear example of how our colleagues prioritize some lives over that of others. And it's not okay. And there have been moments, you know, in my office where we have rainbows and trans pride, like in my office. You know, I don't have with me now, but I have my lapel pin that has my rainbow ribbon and my trans ribbon on it. And there have been folks who come to my office to meet for something else completely different, and then they thank me or they start tearing up because they don't see in the legislate in the chamber in the state capitol anything about LGBTQ history or anything about inclusivity or pride. And so, you know, electing lawmakers who prioritize this, who care about this, who identify from the community is really, really an important step in achieving that collective liberation.
I also just want to mention that Anna made an impression on Governor Ron DeSantis, who made the colossal mistake last year of issuing a Pulse proclamation acknowledging the tragedy 4 years later, and not, that was 3 years later, and not mentioning the LGBTQ or Latinx community. And I think he learned his lesson. Thanks, Anna.
Anytime.
Amazing. Yeah. Just to recap, it's always important just to have these conversations. And, you know, Pulse might have happened a few years ago, but the conversation is still very real and very relevant. So we're going to move on to the next question. The state of Texas has passed a law that allows social workers to turn away LGBTQ plus and disabled people. How do you think Florida will react to this? Do you think that they will follow in Texas's footsteps? We'll start with Representative Eskamani.
I mean, again, I think it's all gonna be very much determined by the legislative landscape for us going into the next session. So maybe Rep. Smith can add more, but I feel like it's very difficult for us to predict what's going to happen next session because so many legislative seats are kind of up in the air right now. And hopefully, if we can flip enough seats the agenda can look completely different than what it looks like right now. So, it would be a decent legislative year if there were no attacks on LGBTQ plus people. It would be a good year if we can get some movement on these bills. And then, of course, it would be horrifyingly bad if they moved these disgustingly negative bills, like Rep. Sabatini's anti-trans kid bill. So I think it kind of depends on the makeup, and which is why it's really important that everyone votes and get your family to vote, get your friends to vote, and make this an election issue. Equality Florida Action PAC has a voter guide on equality issues, Watermark. Our local LGBTQ plus magazine they have printed in their paper the entire voter guide. So a lot of great resources to turn to get that information to help you and your loved ones make informed decisions.
So thank you, Hannah, for sharing the news article as I'm like feverishly reading through it to see what this Texas bill is. So yeah, I mean, look, here's what happens. I don't know, and I didn't have a chance to read this, but what we often see specifically in the Florida legislature, I don't know if this is the angle of the bill in Texas or not, but what we often see is we see the weaponization of religious freedom, and they use that as the way they're going to attack LGBTQ people. There's a really competitive state Senate race that's happening right now in Seminole County for Patricia Sigmund for state Senate against Jason Broder. I bring that up because a few years ago, Jason Broder weaponized religion to try to discriminate against LGBTQ people. He filed a bill that basically said that faith-based adoption agencies would have the legal right to refuse child adoption and child placement services to same-sex couples, which is extremely bigoted and extremely discriminatory. He's now actually saying that he's the reason same-sex couples can adopt children in the state of Florida, which is an abhorrent falsehood and lie. But they often use religion as a weapon to try to discriminate against LGBTQ people. And we have to be very, very cautious about that, and cautious in the way that we respond to it as well, because there is often a rhetoric that is put out there, sometimes perpetuated by the response to these types of so-called religious freedom bills, that assumes that people accept something that is not true, which is that freedom of religion and LGBTQ rights cannot mutually coexist. That they're mutually exclusive concepts somehow. They're not. Religious freedom and LGBTQ equality or dignity in the treatment of LGBTQ people, these are not mutually exclusive concepts. And for those who continue to try to push that agenda, we have to continue calling it out.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for all of your insight so far. So we're gonna move on to our audience questions. So if you look, you should see, audience members should see a raise hand feature. If anybody doesn't see it, feel free to message me or put it in the chat. But that is how we're going to go about taking audience questions. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we will call on people that way. If you're watching from YouTube, you can put it in the chat, and we have our lovely director of public relations checking that chat so he can send me any questions that we get. But okay, so are there any audience questions? Or again, if you don't feel comfortable asking yourself, feel free to send it to either myself or to Anna. We can divvy those up. Okay, we have one from Olivia.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I want something that I've fought for in my community was gender neutral bathrooms, as that affects my little brother who's gender non-conforming, and I've seen how it takes a toll on him when we go to a public place and he doesn't know which bathroom to use. So is that something you would put in legislation or be willing to fight for, and how would you do that in Florida? Because I know I tried to get it passed in Miami-Dade County and that was not happening with the legislation that we have there.
So, and thank you for that question, Olivia, and thank you for sharing part of your personal family story. Our family connections and our personal experiences, especially with trans and gender non-conforming people, is what informs what we know about the community and how we navigate through this. So sharing personal stories always helps win other people over who may not understand. When it comes to how we can intervene in the legislature, first, I want to underscore and remind everyone that we're mostly playing a defensive strategy in the Florida legislature. We need to continue working for a pro-equality majority in Florida where we would actually be able to have that conversation. But I think where it's most important is in public school policy. What we really need right now is we need a proactive pro-LGBTQ statewide policy that affects all 67 school districts, where LGBTQ, but especially trans and gender nonconforming youth actually are treated with dignity and respect. And that also includes having inclusive restroom access policies for LGBTQ students. What happens too often is school districts or individual principals and administrators who don't know anything about how to deal with LGBTQ youth often make terrible mistakes because they don't have guidance from people who know what they're doing and know how to create accepting and affirming environments for LGBTQ students. That's where Equality Florida's work has come in. We have a robust and well-resourced Safe Schools program where Equality Florida trainers work directly with school districts to make sure that they have the training, the tools, and the resources that they need to create affirming and accepting educational spaces for LGBTQ youth in our public schools. And I think that promoting that is the most important first step that we can make in making sure that vulnerable youth specifically is treated equitably in our public schools.
And then I'll add too that I definitely think that ordinances and policy is difficult to pursue just based on the landscape and also the costs. I think that there could be legitimate concerns from small businesses if they have to do any type of construction when it comes to creating gender neutral bathrooms. So I would even recommend, before pursuing a larger policy where you might get pushback, is work with small businesses and get them to do it one by one as you're waiting for a city commission, political partisanship to change, just like the legislative chamber. This is what Equality Florida has had to do because they can't get statewide policy passed. Instead, they go to county by county to push for policy changes. And then when you face things like preemption, for example, in banning plastic straws, a county can't ban plastic straws or plastic bags because they've been preempted by the state legislator. So what they're doing instead, as we try to repeal the bill, is they talk to local businesses and ask businesses one by one, will you stop using plastic? And it kind of almost becomes a public relations opportunity for small businesses to say, we're gender inclusive, we're LGBTQ plus safe. And if you have single stall bathrooms, it's even easier to change it. I mean, because at that point, all you do is make a commitment that these bathrooms can be gender neutral, teach your staff on what that means and install signage. And as long as you're meeting building code requirements, and that's something else to consider. Some buildings might have challenges just based on code requirements, but I mean, I think it's a pretty easy shift. You have single stall restrooms to change those and be gender neutral. And, so many of us have, especially in the Starbucks at UCF, for example, I use both bathrooms there because it's like, I gotta go. I don't care what the sign says. And obviously as a privileged hetero cis person, it's easier for me to do, I think. It would be so easy for UCF to make some of these bathrooms gender neutral. So always think about your local community. And, in your case, Olivia, Miami-Dade, like that's such a smart go-to because that's like your neighborhood. You probably have relationships there. And then I also encourage you to think about how do you start with a tangible goal like a college campus, because or with individual small businesses, because obviously going straight to the county can be challenging because the institution is so huge. There's so much politics involved. Like Rep. Smith said, look at the school board. Sometimes school boards are going to be much more open to these ideas because school boards tend to witness the diversity more every day. For example, even counties like Brevard County, so conservative, their school board has passed non-discrimination policies, but the county never would at this point, but the school board has. So I do think considering school districts as a starting point is really smart. And then also working with local businesses. If enough local businesses sign on to say, we're gender neutral, everyone should be gender neutral too, now you're building power, not just with yourself and your family, but with small businesses that potentially are political donors and have relationships with the city commission. So that can be another way to kind of build power collectively. So you're not standing there by yourself with your family, that you're sitting there with 15 small businesses who've already done this. It's not that hard to do. You know what I mean? It kind of helps build the momentum around a campaign.
Thank you. Yeah, I was able to go to my school board and get it on the 5-year plan from the superintendent because, like, money-wise, it wasn't something they were able to do right away. And I was also able to get it in my local, like, suburb, every public building, and they put it in legislation for like new construction. So that was cool.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And you're doing that 100% right. Like, think about your local neighborhoods. And it's smart too to consider new construction, right? Because they're already going to spend money on building things. So if you're going to build it, then build it to be gender inclusive. So that's super, super smart. Like, well done. And I would add like renewable energy, same thing, like any excuses about being too expensive to readapt buildings. Okay, we can have that debate later, but make a commitment that every new building, has these elements involved. So that's amazing. Congratulations.
Amazing. Alrighty, so our next question comes from Matthew. He is the Director of Outreach at the UCF Democrats. I'm gonna go ahead. Yeah, there you go.
Awesome. So, hello. As someone who is a bisexual Latinx, I want to be as much of an ally and as anti-racist as I possibly can in the classroom. So what would each of you recommend someone like me who is going into teaching? How can I be a model for these kids and influence them for the better?
That's a great question.
That is a great question. Rep. Smith, you want to start?
Yes. Well, first of all, being your true and authentic self when you have the privilege of being able to do that without high risk of violence or intimidation or discrimination is an incredible first step. A lot of people still aren't out about who they are, even in the year 2020, even when there could be certainly huge or significant societal consequences for being out, for example, as bi. But the fact that you led with that is legit and authentic, and I want to applaud you with that. And I think that that's a good place to start, because I myself in my own life, I try to apply this rule as much as possible. I know that even as an LGBTQ Latinx person who has faced discrimination, even survived hate violence in the past, I know that right now I sit in a point of privilege, that I have the ability with few consequences currently to be out, to be married to my husband, to hold his hand in public. And I see that also living our lives openly and authentically, not only as something that we can do proudly because we want to and it makes us happy, but there's also an element of responsibility there, that we're role models for other people, for LGBTQ youth as well. And obviously being in a position as, a teacher, a future teacher, you are the most important role model that any kid will have separate from their parent or guardian. So keep doing what you're doing, and thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is, I'm not sure what grade level you're going to be teaching in, because I think that also helps dictate what type of curriculum could be integrated.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But
aftercare for kindergarten.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay, that's incredible. Yeah, that's incredible. What an important age, I mean, my first thought is like thinking about any type of if you could integrate history into any curriculum, even if it's, for kindergarten, obviously not like textbook history, but I remember learning nothing about LGBTQ plus issues when I was that age. When I was I don't think I did until I got to my 8th grade. 8th grade is when I met my first openly gay friend, and it's because we both had a crush on the same boy, and that helped me really become a better accomplice, because it was my first friend, and you deserve to be loved, and you deserve happiness. But and that friend, we're still friends today, and they really did struggle with mental health and so many challenges around not being accepted. So I wonder about Equality Florida has a safe schools curriculum to even tap into, but just thinking about how do we prevent bullying from happening? How do we prevent bystanders? How do we encourage bystanders to do something versus just stand there? And then teaching parts of history that are A, accurate, but B, lift up the stories of struggle within the LGBTQ plus spaces. I don't remember when I learned about Harvey Milk, but it was way too late in my life. I never had an intentional textbook opportunity to learn about LGBTQ plus history until I got to college. I mean, it's just shocking, how it's not mandated or not part of a part of our curriculum. So to be really intentional in, creating a space where kids can ask questions about that, even symbols of acceptance, in your classroom, having a pride flag, having a trans flag, like even those little symbols can give a student comfort to say something or ask a question. And that's an important part of this work too. I think it's just embracing wonder, letting kids ask questions so that, and provide answers that are not judgmental, not shaming, not embarrassing. If we embrace wonder more every day in our lives, I feel like a lot of people's perspectives would change, both those answering the question and those asking. But unfortunately, we're very quick to judge. We're very quick to kind of make assumptions about people. But for children, all they do is wonder. So it's a really great opportunity to meet that level of curiosity with clear and factual and important information.
Awesome. So our next question comes from Logan. He is the College Democrat LGBTQ plus caucus chair. Let me look through this here. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, want to say thank you to both our reps for being here tonight and talking to us. My question is specifically about domestic violence in the LGBT community. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and unfortunately this year, there's been so much going on and so many people affected by so many different things that it sort of hasn't been as focused or in the spotlight. But in a lot of states, domestic violence protections and laws, they don't extend to members of the LGBT community. A lot of women's shelters are still allowed to turn away trans women in their time of need. And I was just wondering how you think we as a state, we as a population, we as a nation can do better to ensure that our community is given better resources and aid and the ability to protect itself against those who would harm us.
Well, my first reaction is such a great question. Harbor House here locally is very much a champion when it comes to inclusivity. We did a virtual event with them maybe 2 weeks ago to mark Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we just did one last week too with Senator Lori Berman from South Florida to really elevate domestic violence, because like you said, it's not getting a lot of attention right now due to the pandemic. So during our conversation with Harbor House, we talked about not only LGBTQ plus inclusivity, but also inclusivity for undocumented people working to escape violence. And so my first thought is that, creating relationships with local shelters to see, what their policies are. I think most shelters want to do the right thing, but again, it could just be a knowledge gap and not clearly understanding that domestic violence takes shape in every sort of relationship, and then having staff that are trained to understand that, not to turn people away. But Harper House is a great example. They accept every type of person, and they definitely, obviously when it comes to just statistical breakdowns, we do see women as being overrepresented, if you will, in domestic violence cases. But they have a great track record on LGBTQ plus inclusivity. I see their staff at different events all the time that are focused on moving beyond the assumption that domestic violence only looks a certain way. So I think it very much is a local effort to make sure that nonprofits are committed to this work. And then, talking to these nonprofits about what are their legislative priorities, because the domestic violence community should be leading the conversation on this as well. They would be some of the best spokespeople on this. And if there was going to be legislation filed, on this issue, I would hope that the shelters would be the first in line to endorse the bill and to help to progress it forward. So really important opportunity to build relationships with local shelters and see where they stand here in Florida. That could help potentially lead to policy to just provide protections. I mean, most of I think Florida's statute in general is definitely binary. So there's lots of gendered language in Florida statute in general. But I definitely, I don't think there's any permission in the legislature to discriminate against folks for different reasons when it comes to domestic violence. The hotline is supposed to be accessible to everyone. I will say that just having enough room is a problem in our shelters in general, especially during the pandemic where we've seen calls increase. I haven't had any situations where someone was turned away from a domestic violence shelter, but I have situations during this pandemic of people turned away from homeless shelters, not because of a particular discriminatory reason, but because they literally have no room. So there's another question, I think, around just funding for these type of safety nets and services in general, and making sure that when we fund these organizations that they are inclusive to LGBTQ plus people. Any organization that receives public money needs to be inclusive. And every domestic violence shelter in Florida receives some degree of public money.
Okay, awesome. We're going to take one more audience question. Is there anyone that would like to ask anything?
And I was going to say, as y'all are percolating on what your final question is going to be, to Logan's question, I know that there's a distinction between homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters, but this is just, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, this is just another reason why the stakes in this election are so important. We had federal protections in place during the Obama-Biden administration that specifically protected against LGBTQ discrimination at federally funded homeless shelters. It specifically had language prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Those exact protections were repealed and removed by the Trump-Pence administration. They're gone. Those federal protections are no longer there. And it's literally, I just checked on the Biden-Harris website. They specifically have the issue of discrimination at shelters listed on their platform, saying that they're going to be reinstating it. So, which I just want to say is pretty cool for a presidential candidate to be talking about these things like in such a progressive and important and powerful way. So, preaching to the choir.
Definitely. Thanks to both of you.
Alrighty, any last questions before we wrap up? Okay, awesome. So thank you both to, all right, Matthew. Okay, thank you both to Representative Smith and Representative Eskamani for joining us tonight. I also want to thank from the College Democrats, UCF PSA for joining us, for proposing this event. We love working with you guys, so thank you so much. Before we wrap up, I just want to take a couple minutes to encourage everyone, if you have not already, to vote. We're in our last week of early voting. If you're an Orange County resident, if you're registered in Orange County, you can vote on campus. It's in the Live Oak Center, which is like near Garage B in Farrell Commons, near that dining hall down there. You can either go and vote in person, or you can drop off your mail ballot if you don't feel comfortable going inside. They have a mail ballot drop-off box, so you can just fill that out and drop it in. At this point, what's the date? The 26th. So it's a little bit late to be sending it through the mail. So I would encourage you definitely to be going and dropping it off if you haven't sent it already. So making sure that you're also voting the entire ballot. If you need any help voting, like if you're not an Orange County voter and you don't know where to go, we can definitely help you out. Feel free to reach out to us. Yes, like Diego said in the chat, they are open on weekends. So if you can't make it during the week, and so then obviously you can vote on election day, but we would encourage you to vote early. Also, we have Dylan has an event that he wants to talk a little bit about.
Yes, hello people. For anybody who doesn't know, I'm Dylan. I'm Vice President of College Democrats, and I'm also the chair of Knights for Joe here on campus. And there's actually 2 events that I want to plug. The first one is one that Knights for Joe is hosting with our club's Women's Caucus and LGBTQ plus caucus, especially with the discussion that we've had tonight. It's going to be Thursday night on Zoom, and the information for that will be posted tomorrow. And it's going to be entirely about the fight for reproductive justice and what the Biden agenda, kind of what Carlos and Ana have alluded to throughout, what that agenda actually looks like, and how we can actually fight for it. Because I think Carlos made a really good point that November 3rd is the end of the beginning. And having to make sure that these concerns are heard. And that's going to be a great event to learn all about that. There is also another event to bounce off what Hannah just said, that if you have not voted, and this came just hot off the press right now, like steaming, simmering, I got it like 15 minutes ago, that we have been approved to have an event this Wednesday at 3 p.m. on campus. It's going to be socially distanced, and we're working with the UCF administration to make it possible. But we are going to be having an extremely important surrogate coming from the Biden campaign. You guys may have heard of her before. She very, very narrowly lost a governor race in the state of Georgia. She's somebody who's been leading the fight against voter suppression. And I'm happy to announce that Stacey Abrams is coming to the UCF campus this Wednesday to have a rally that'll eventually lead to a walk to the polls. So I'm extremely excited for it. I'm very excited to meet her. And again, we're going to be getting more information about that, especially more tomorrow as the details are finalized. But I have been told that she is confirmed to be in attendance, and we're working, again, for anybody concerned, very closely with both UCF PD and the administration to make sure it's as safe of an event as possible. If anything, I actually have the Mobilize link for that, so I'm going to put that in the chat if anybody is interested in signing up for that. But yeah, I encourage you guys, especially if you have not voted yet, that this is a great opportunity to not only hear a national leader speak, but also specifically end up getting to vote on campus, like Hannah was saying at Live Vote. So that's all I have. And again, I just, on behalf of everybody, really want to thank both Ana and Carlos for coming out. Always love seeing you guys, and I'll pass it back to Hannah.
And can I also just say that y'all are doing just incredible work all year round, but y'all have been really crucial voices during this election cycle. It was just on, God, was it Saturday or Sunday? I don't even remember. It was just this weekend,
Sunday,
actually, that Dylan and Paula actually had incredible remarks when we welcomed America Ferrera over at the Alafaya Branch Library. So thank you for using your voices and telling your stories. They were really powerful and impactful. And thank you for continuing to do the work that you all do.
Just want to reiterate one more time, obviously masks will be required and social distancing will be encouraged and all of that stuff. We definitely want to put everybody's safety first while we make sure that we're getting to the polls. I'm also going to pass it over to Ana to give some PSA updates.
Hi. So yes, I am the president of PSA, Pride Student Association. If you are not familiar with us, we do have a website that I'm going to post right now. And we have a GBM general body meeting coming up on Wednesday at 5. We have general body meetings every other week. And this week we're going to be talking about different LGBTQ plus relationships, such as polyamory and the asexual and aromantic spectrum. So if you're interested in that, all of our links will be on our website. Everything related to PSA is on our website. So if you're interested, check us out, join our Discord server, and thank you for coming.
Okay, before we let you go, we have one more event. Sorry about that. Busy event calendar. So Matthew's gonna go real quick.
Yeah, super busy week. So tomorrow at 6 p.m., we're teaming up with the BSU and our Blackhawks chair. He's here, Jalen Grant. And we're going to be doing a voter information session where we're going to be talking about voter suppression, what's going on right now, historical voter suppression against the African American community in Florida. And yeah, you guys should come out 6 p.m. tomorrow. So.
Alrighty, well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you especially to Representative Smith and Eskamani for joining us. If you haven't already, if we haven't said it enough, please make sure that you're voting in this election, not only for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but for your down ballot Democrats like Representative Smith or Eskamani, depending on where you live. But yeah, if you have any questions or need anything, you can always reach out to College Dems, and I'm sure Pride Student Association as well.